So we're just going to get some background information. So let's start with Tina and then Eliot. So where were you born? When were you born?
It all started in Seattle, Washington, 1944. So I'm 65, and my parents were born and raised in Seattle, so I'm actually fourth generation. And I got my education there through high school and university and medical school. And it was during medical school that I met this handsome young intern. It changed my life. I never lived in Seattle again after I married Eliot. So, but I grew up also in a family that loved to hike and loved to be in the outdoors. We did a lot of camping, and we camped all over the West, all up and down the West Coast and into Montana and Yellowstone. And so I really spent a lot of time in the outdoors. My dad was a naturalist, and my mom was a good sport.
I'm next? Okay. I was born, I don't like to admit this, but I was born in Houston, Texas in 1941. And we soon thereafter, it was right after the war, Second World War, and we moved, I was born just right after Pearl Harbor, but we moved to Texas right after the war. I was born in, I'm sorry, this is confusing. I was born in Houston. During the war, we moved back to Philadelphia because my dad was in Europe with the Army. We moved back to Texas after the war, and we lived on a little truck farm on the Rio Grande near Laredo, Texas. And we lived there for about 3 years, and then we moved back east and lived in Maryland and then Maine. And I sort of have a checkered history of moving all over the place. But my connection with this wonderful part of the world started really when I was in medical school, because 5 of us, I went to medical school in Montreal. I went to college in Boston at Harvard, and then I went to medical school in Montreal. And 5 of us in medical school decided to run the Fraser River in British Columbia. It had never been run before from its headwaters to the ocean, so the good Lord protects the innocent. So the 5 of us, with a combination of canoes and then rafts and then canoes, made it all the way down the Fraser through Hell's Gate and all this big stuff. And we were heroes for about 1 day in Vancouver. And but that was my first introduction to the West. And then another thing that happened to me about the same time was I was lucky enough in college, actually it preceded the Fraser River trip, to be a guide on the Middle Fork of the Salmon River in Idaho. And again, those were the days when there was no training, no restrictions, no license, no nothing. And the fellow who hired us hired my roommate and I, because my roommate's father was a friend of somebody's in Boise, and we'd never been in a raft in our life. We'd never done any white water. And the first group we took down were a bunch of Boy Scouts. And I thought if their parents knew who was taking them down the river, they would have had a fit. But anyway, we survived the summer. And the point of all this is I really fell in love with the West. I couldn't believe that the sun could come up and be shining on a mountain and yet not shining on me, because I grew up in flat country. So I fell in love with the West, and particularly the Northwest. So I came out to, I'm probably getting ahead of you here, but I interned in Seattle at the end of my medical school, and I met this lovely lady to my left here. And Tina often says that she's not sure whether I fell in love with her or the Northwest, and I say it was both, really. And I'm still here.
That's kind of interesting. Started in the East, moved all around, but after all this travel, settled here with a 4th generation Westerner. That's really sweet. That's nice, that connection. What type of, you both went to medical school, so what type of medicine did you study, each of you?
Go ahead.
Tina, what did you study?
I ended up in family practice. I did mostly pediatrics and internal medicine, but I ended up in doing mostly women's health care, family practice in Wenatchee.
Eliot, how about you? What was your specialty?
I wanted to be a pediatrician until I did my internship at Harborview, and I probably, as part of my training, I delivered about 100 babies, And if you're practicing in Harborview, a lot of the mothers are terribly dysfunctional folks with a lot of drug problems and, you know, cocaine addiction and you know, fetal alcohol syndrome. And after all that, I thought, wait a minute, maybe I don't really want to, I'm not sure I have the guts to do this. So I entered, after internship, this was in the middle of the Vietnam War, and this was 1968, right, at the end of my internship. So I've always been interested in flying, and I actually had a pilot's license prior to that, but I decided to sign up for the flight surgery program with the Navy, and you had to sign up for an extra 6 months, basically an extra year above your 2-year commitment. So I went into the Naval Aerospace Medical Program in Pensacola, and there I got, while I was in the Navy as a flight surgeon, I got interested in ophthalmology, which is, you know, eye medicine and surgery. And so when I got out of the Navy, I did a residency in ophthalmology, and then almost my entire private practice in ophthalmology was here in Wenatchee at the Eye and Ear Clinic. So I came from Vancouver, British Columbia to Wenatchee, and been here ever since.
And so, Tina, Eliot is what brought you to Wenatchee? Is that?
Well, we were married at the end of his internship, so I followed him around in the Navy a bit. I mean, did part of my training down in Pensacola, and then I did my, after medical school, I went down to Fresno, and we lived together in Fresno, and I went to Fresno General Hospital, and he commuted down to Lemoore Naval Air Station. So then we both went to Vancouver together.
So then how North Central Washington from Vancouver?
That's a very good question. And I don't want to draw it out too long, but basically I was in my residency for 3 years in Vancouver, and we had one old rusty car, and Tina needed it for the kids, so I rode my bicycle to work every day in Vancouver, which is about 5 miles of hilly riding, if you know Vancouver. We lived sort of not too far from the university and UBC, and so I'd ride my bike, and I rode my bike in the dark and the rain, and the dark and the rain, and the rain and the light, and the rain and the dark, and I got really sick of the rain. We love Vancouver, and I love the coast and stuff, but at the end of my residency, or actually toward the end, we started looking for places to practice, and we wanted to, both of us grew up on the ocean, so we wanted to be within weekend distance of salt water. And so we looked at basically cities or towns of about Wenatchee size, but on the east sides of the mountains. So I looked at Yakima, and I looked at Wenatchee, and I looked at Bend, Oregon. I looked at Klamath Falls, and then I looked at Bellingham, which doesn't make any sense in terms of the rain, but it's a great town. And I grew up in a small town. Tina grew up in Seattle, of course, but I didn't want to practice in a city. I wanted to practice in a medium-sized town. As an ophthalmologist, you can't practice in a very small town because there are not enough patients, but Wenatchee fit the bill perfectly. So, and if I can tell you a little story about it, we took our little boy, Grant, at that point was 2, right, or 1.5, and we did a vacation at Stehekin. When I had a week's vacation from residency, we took the boat up Lake Chelan. I'd never been in this part of the world at all. We took the boat up, and if you can imagine Lake Chelan on an early September day, it was just perfectly beautiful. And I thought, oh my God, I looked around at Stehekin and this country and stuff, and thought I'd love to come back here. And then when we interviewed, I guess I interviewed once the first time myself. It was another beautiful September day. It was Wenatchee at its best, North Central Washington at its best. All the apples were turning ripe, and it was this golden day. And I had to drive back to Vancouver, and I drove up, and at Stevens Pass there's this big dark wall of cloud waiting. It just dumped rain on me all the way back to Vancouver. So I said, I'm going back there as soon as I can. So anyway, that was, probably silly reasons, but it made sense at the time.
It's like divine reasoning, the cloud at the pass.
Right, exactly.
So since you both come from pretty different environments, literally, what do you most appreciate about this place? Since you've been here, you were a 4th generation Seattleite, you've moved everywhere, so now you've been here for so long. Why? What do you most appreciate?
it's a beautiful part of the world. And, you know, the confluence of the Wenatchee and the Columbia River and the foothills of the Cascade Mountains and beautiful shrub steppe in the springtime. And I love our foothills. I mean, it's just, we love to hike, and we used to do a lot of river running and love to ski, cross country and downhill. And it just was a great place to raise our children too. You know, they could walk to school, and you didn't really worry about them too much. They had that old blue truck, so wherever they were, everybody knew who they were.
That's right.
You couldn't get away with too much. But it was a great place to raise our children, and the people were just immediately very warm and friendly. And so it worked out to be a good place for us.
Was the fact that you had children and a family, was that one of the reasons that you felt so strong about preserving this area and helping to improve the environment? I mean, was that one of the big factors? Or Tina, Eliot?
You just have to choose.
I'll take that one. Yes, but I think initially it was probably more self-centered than that. I mean, I think, you know, I would echo what Tina said. I mean, long before we got here, we were very much into backpacking in the mountains and canoeing and rivers and basically the outdoors. And for those who have lived nowhere else than the Northwest, it's just such a spectacular, I mean, you don't realize how much it has all these things in a very small space. And I was enchanted by Wenatchee's sort of proximity to the mountains. And frankly, I've grown to love the canyons and the coulees as well, but that wasn't the initial attraction. So anyway, to answer your question, I think initially we became interested in conservation and preservation of open space, really for more selfish reasons, because we wanted the rivers to remain clean. We wanted the hillsides to be accessible. We wanted, you know, access to outdoor recreation and that kind of quality. But I think certainly as one grows older and as one's children grow up, I mean, it was a major factor in terms of the lifestyle it afforded our children. I mean, the fact that you can ski 20 minutes away, and downhill ski, you can cross-country ski, at least it used to be when we had winters, you could cross-country ski even in town, but certainly in Leavenworth, places like that, it was really a very special place for the kids to grow up. And as I said, I grew up in a small town, so I like Wenatchee's a lot bigger than the town I grew up in, but it still afforded, particularly in the 70s when we moved here, it was still the kind of place where you could walk down Wenatchee Avenue and you knew half the people on the street. It had a smaller town feeling than it does now. It's grown a lot.
So how did your feelings about the conservation and preserving that, how did that lead to the land trust? So how did you go from those sort of selfish, you call them, feelings to let's start a land trust?
I think I'm going to pass this mostly to Eliot because he was aware of land trusts, and he was we were members of the Nature Conservancy, and he was getting mailings from conservation groups. And I think I'm going to let him tell this part of the story.
Do you want to talk about your involvement in the beginning, or what you specifically thought or did at all?
Well, not long after the land trust was formed, there were some situations that came up that made it critical for the land trust to be there. And one was that TPL was trying to save an in-holding in the Spider Meadows. It was privately owned, and it was going to be sold to a developer right up in the meadow. And so TPL came to the land trust and actually you and Dick Riemann wrote a letter together.
Right.
And it went out to the membership, and by that time I think there were maybe 300 or more letters.
I wish there were that many, but that many people answered the letter. Yes.
Right. They had a response, and they got contributions from over 300 people. It was the most successful single fundraising letter that TPL ever saw at that time. So that was in about 1985 or 6, maybe a little later.
It was right after, the land trust was actually formed in 1985, hence our 25th anniversary. That was when when it became a legal organization. But there was sort of a lot of thinking and thrashing about that went on before that. But as Tina said, the Spider Meadow issue, not only was sort of the first major issue we had to deal with, it also galvanized the community, because people said, wait a minute, what do you mean there's private, it was a mining claim right at Spider Meadow, right at as you enter Spider Meadow. And this guy was going to put a road into Spider Meadow and develop it for recreation home sites.
And log.
And log a lot of the whole trail into Spider Meadow. So we all said, oh my God, we can't let this happen. So the land trust, it was sort of our first sort of real test of an organization, because we got a lot of support from the community. They weren't necessarily members, but we got the word out, and Dick Reeman and I wrote a letter and co-signed it. And it according to Trust for Public Land, it made a huge difference. The fact that the local community was that engaged and felt very strongly about it. The other thing that happened early on, I can't remember the exact year, was the Peshastin Pinnacles, because the Peshastin Pinnacles was privately owned, and the orchardists who owned it at that time became concerned. It was sort of the increasing concern about litigation and that sort of thing. And they became very concerned about possibly being sued if somebody was hurt climbing on the pinnacles, which they'd allowed informal climbing there, but they were going to close it. In fact, they did close it. And Mark Shipman and Don Fager, both of whom are avid climbers, sort of said, we've got to do something about this. So we, again, Don and Mark did a lot of the footwork on it, but we got a lot of letters. They met with the owners. We talked to State Parks. State Parks initially wasn't interested. And again, TPL was a player in that, but we were able to raise the money through TPL to to basically buy the pinnacles from the orchardists. And then TPL sold the pinnacles to State Park. So that's why Peshastin Pinnacle State Park is there. But it almost wasn't. It was going to be closed. So that was another kind of a higher profile issue that began to garner attention to the land trust, and therefore members, and our membership started to grow. And then we got those two things done, and then there's a very funny story, because our first easement was actually with Jack File. Jack File, as you know, is the orchardist up along the east side of the river, who's been fighting the Rocky Reach Trail so adamantly over the last 10 years. But Jack was a supporter of the land trust and a supporter or he was anxious to do an easement, basically to allow people to get to the river. So he donated an easement from the road, from Route 28, to the river. It's still there. It's right next to his fruit stand. I don't think anybody ever uses it, because we actually had a sign for a while. The sign disappeared, and with everything else going on, it's sort of, but it exists. It's a legal document. It was the first easement. And then, now I'm talking too much. Do you want to go into the next 10-year history?
The whole process for the Peshastin Pinnacles took just about 5 years.
Yeah, it did.
But then that was a happy ending, because State Parks was willing to take it on. And just about that time now, about 1985, is that when the Save the Riverfront, and then it came to a point where the land trust basically had a meeting that said, okay, what are we going to do about this East Side Trail? Because they'd already defeated.
It was later. It was the early 90s.
It was 89 or 90, right about in there.
Yeah.
They fought it for 5 years, and then,
better than I do.
I just reviewed it.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm cheating.
Yeah.
But anyway, so, about then, you called a meeting of all the people that were interested in the trail, and all the members and the leading members of the land trust.
Of the board, yeah.
On the board, and that was a pivotal meeting.
But prior to that, there was a period where the land trust almost disappeared. There was a period of about 5 or 7 years in there, and again, I can't remember the exact years, but where really nothing much was happening. We had, I wouldn't say opposition, but certainly a lack of support from county government and city government and stuff like that. I think they regarded us as with suspicion, particularly in terms of property rights issues and things like that. And the membership kind of dropped off year by year a little bit, and there was sort of a core group of people like Joni Vandervoort and Gloria Kupferman and again, you're better at this than I am. Tina and I and Mark Shipman and sort of the people who started it kind of held it together, and basically it really was an Ed Meyer, but it really was a group of about 4 or 5 women who held it together. They would have meetings every month, and Joni Vandervoort would serve dinner and things like that. But it became sort of more of a social club and less of an activist group, if you will.
Actually,
go ahead.
And the low point for the land trust was really while everybody's focus was on the East Side Trail. And a lot of the members of the land trust then went into the Complete the Loop coalition. Because we wanted to get the East Side Trail. The trail along the Wenatchee side had been completed by the PUD. And now the highway was defeated. But there was a transportation corridor along the east side, and the vision was to have a trail. So it was a full-out effort to make that happen and get the funding for it. And Bob Parlett and Gordon Condon Sr. stepped up and co-chaired that.
Which was at a land trust meeting.
Which is that pivotal meeting that we...
Talk about that meeting a little bit more, because I've always been a little
Well,
there.
I'll just set the stage and then Eliot can talk about it. But a land trust, it was too complicated for a land trust. It was too much wheeling and dealing. It wasn't it needed a very focused group that had a little bit different talent. So the meeting was really, well, you tell about the meeting because you set it up.
Okay. Again, to back up a little bit, when the Save the Riverfront Committee stopped the highway, the land trust really was started because it was felt that the Save the Riverfront Committee was too controversial, and we needed a new group to basically deal with conservation issues on the east side and then the larger community. Maybe it was the late 80s. In the late 80s, it was felt that the land trust was too controversial because the East Side Trail was very political. There were a lot of community leaders were very opposed to it. They still wanted the highway. They were very upset that the highway hadn't been built. So there was a lot of opposition to anything but a highway there, even years after the shoreline management hearing decision. So it was felt that the land trust could not be the main group to try and build a trail on the east side. So I think it was me, but it was probably other people too, convened or had the idea of convening a meeting where we would ask some other community leaders to come to a meeting. Basically, it was a land trust meeting, but the point of it was what group can take on developing an East Side Trail? Because we're too controversial. In other words, the commissioners were nervous about us, the city fathers were nervous about us, even the Wenatchee world was nervous about us, okay? I mean, we didn't have their support at that time. That's changed, which has been wonderful. So we had Bob Parlett and Gordon Congdon Sr. came to the meeting at our invitation, and I think several other people. And forgive me because I can't remember all who was there, but it was a much bigger group. We asked probably 7 or 8 other community leaders to come. And we discussed what to do basically with the east side of the river, and we also discussed, quite frankly, that we didn't think the land trust was in a position to take this on. It just wasn't a strong enough organization. And those of you that know Bob Parlett and Gordon Congdon Sr. will understand this when they both stood up and they said, "We'll do this." And they're very effective people. They're charismatic leaders, and they had a history of leadership in the community. Bob had been the attorney for the PUD, so he knew PUD issues really well. He knew the FERC licensing issues really well. And Gordon Congdon Sr. was already a great lover of the east side of the river and knew it very well, sort of the physical background. So anyway, they formed the Complete the Loop Coalition. So the Complete the Loop Coalition basically was born out of the Land Trust, if you will, but it was a totally separate organization. And the idea was that it didn't carry the political baggage that the Land Trust did at that point.
So at this point, everyone in the Land Trust, all the things you're doing, it's all volunteers.
Yes.
So when did you go and why from a group of volunteers to paid staff? How were you able to rebound and get the funding and support to do that?
There's a story that it leads into that. Well, as I said, all the energy, community energy went into creating East Side Trail. And I was on the Complete the Loop Coalition. And the Land Trust still was there and did a few things, but it was more behind the scenes. When that was finished, then what was happening?
We looked at each other and said, now what?
What was happening is that the state was starting to recognize the salmon as endangered, or the federal government was seeing it too. I mean, they were starting to list salmon species, and the first was the Upper Columbia Chinook, I think. But during that time, the Land Trust was a pretty sleepy little group, but they were great. They were still there, and Eliot didn't go to all the meetings, but there was a meeting that he wasn't going to be able to go to, so Dick Grieman and I went to that meeting, and it was a pivotal meeting because the Upper Columbia Chinook was just listed as an endangered species, I think, or was about to be. Maybe it was about to be. But Betsy Bloomfield, who worked for the state Fish and Wildlife, was there to give a presentation. And her presentation was so beautifully done and so graphic about a river and what a river is about, how it can be diminished by all the things that we do to channel it till it gets down to just a channel of a river, but all the things, and how important it is for salmon. And it was, and she said that Fish and Wildlife is going to be working with funding from the state to buy conservation easements along the White River and the Entiat. And they needed a functioning land trust to hold those easements. So she's pretty much looked us in the eye and said, we need a strong functioning land trust, as only Betsy Bloomfield can do that. So it energized the land trust.
Yeah, and we also
Can we
had
get in for a second? There's some background noise that just came on.
Yeah. I'm not sure.
Is that the furnace?
That's the fridge.
That's the
the
fridge.
fridge.
Mhm.
Okay, let's think that's gonna be a problem.
I don't think there's anything we can do about it. I think that'll be fine. It's
I
directional.
don't know how to turn it off.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Don't turn off the fridge.
Yeah, right.
It shouldn't.
So at that time, can I tell about the forum?
Sure. I just want to tell about the Come to Jesus meeting we had, but we can do it either way. They sort of coincided, yeah.
I think that happened after the forum because that's when everything started to roll.
Okay.
So at this point in time, the Coalition for Moderate Leadership was giving lots of presentations, public forums, and it was basically Dick, Raymond, Gordon Condon, myself, and Gene Sherritt.
Gordon Condon Jr. now.
Junior, excuse me.
Yeah.
And we'd done a series on smart growth and other things. But when we realized we really needed to re-energize the land trust, Eliot and Gordon and I basically put together a voluntary land conservation title forum, evening program, and advertised it and got a very good turnout. And we brought in speakers from all over the state.
And was that Daniel Kimmis, or was that a different?
No, that was
a different one. Okay.
was the coalition. Yeah, that
Yeah.
was. But those were good lead-ins to this. But we had Chris DeForest come and talk about the Inland Northwest Land Trust. We had a commissioner from Snohomish County that was just awesome. And we had some very, very good speakers that came in and presented the whole concept of the land trust and what needs to be done now to, at this point in time. Anyway, it was very good.
What I was referring to is about this time, and maybe I can't remember the timing, because Tina and Gordon particularly had several community forums that they organized. So there was a lot of community interest in conservation and also a lot of controversy. It was the time when the militia was really active, the Sagebrush Rebellion was really active, the property rights movement was really active. So you had a very dynamic tension between conservation, sort of community benefit versus private benefit. I mean, the same discussion is still going on now, but it sort of reached a higher level in the community because of the forums that Tina and Gordon and others put on.
We also had county commissioners that were very against conservation.
Yeah.
And they were pretty lethal guys. So that set a stage for
it certainly was let's say
empowering land trust people.
It was a dynamic. The community was really quite split, and that what led up to some of the suspicion about the land trust already. Anyway, in terms of the land trust organization itself, we had what I call the Come to Jesus meeting, in which we basically, the 7 or 8 of us that were on the board, in response to what Tina was talking about, in response to what Betsy Bloomfield said, and in response to this apparent funding that was just beginning. This was the very beginning of salmon recovery funding. We said, we've got to get this organization going. We either have to close it down and start a new organization, or we have to get this organization going. And we thought, we can't really do it with a purely volunteer board. We were all working, or most of us were working.
Well,
Sure, go ahead.
The first thing is that you started inviting key people onto the board. You strengthened the board.
Yeah, we did.
And then we started having retreats, both at our house and up at our cabin, and doing strategic planning. So we had Eliot developed a very strong board. Some of those people are still on the board, which is really good.
What this led to, and the cute story about it, which I think several of you have heard before, is that we decided that that we couldn't continue unless we had staff. We needed some staff who would work at it at least 4/5 time. So 2 things happened. Gordon Congdon was getting really sick of being a cherry farmer, and he wanted to sell his cherry orchard, Gordon Congdon Jr. And Harriet Bullitt was she was reaching a time in her life when she decided she wanted to do something with her money, something for the Wenatchee Valley watershed. So Harriet was just starting to form the Icicle Fund. And little Eliot, went and I called up Harriet and I said, Harriet, like so many other people have done to Harriet, can I come talk to you about the land trust? And so I drove up to Leavenworth, and it was this sort of foggy afternoon, and we were up there in the chalet. And I said, Harriet, and I was quite nervous about this because this was a whole different sort of league. We were dealing with $10 donations, $25 donations, which is basically kept us in staples and typewriters kind of thing. And I said, Harriet, I remember I was sitting across from her, and she was sort of looking sweetly at me, and I said, Harriet, we're going to need enough money to start to hire staff. So I said, would you consider a $5,000 donation to the land trust? Whereupon she looked at me for a long while. I thought she was going to say, are you crazy? Whereupon she said, is that all you want? And I realized I'd violated one of the major rules of fundraising. But nevertheless, she wrote me a $5,000 check, and Tina and I can't remember the exact sequence, but to make a long story short, we had lunch with Gordon.
Well,
Congdon.
actually, I'm sorry. You started advertising
That's
all
right.
over the Northwest for
I
a
forgot
director,
that part,
a
yeah.
hired director for the land trust. And even interviewed a few people and read resumes and nothing really, there was no traction. And then in the summer, Eliot and I looked at each other and I said, you know, the best person possible would be Gordon Condon, and we both agreed.
Right. So we had lunch with Gordon.
So, yeah.
And Gordon said, well, I've never, quote unquote, I've never had a real job in my life. Of course, he's done all kinds of wonderful things. So I said, well, this is a chance for a real job. So anyway, we hired him, and not just for $5,000, but that was sort of the seed money. But the Icicle Fund was up and running at that point, and I was actually one of the original board members on the Icicle Fund board. And we worked out an agreement where they would give us, and I can't remember the exact amounts, but it was like $50,000 to develop staff and an office. We never had an office. The office was either in our house or Joni Vandevoort's house or Mark Shipman's house. So that was the beginning of a whole different chapter. And I think, you know, we now are entering sort of the last 10 or 15 years, but Gordon was the perfect person because he comes from an old Wenatchee family. He had a lot of local credibility. He's a very good speaker. He'd been on the planning board for the county, so he had experience with both county government and with the community. And he's a very articulate guy, as we all know. So he really moved the thing to a whole new level. And from that point on, it really started to grow and started to develop as a more effective organization.
Gordon was very high profile because he was the moderator for all of the Distinguished Lecture Series and the Smart Growth Series and that we had been doing. So he was well known, and he had a lot of people who believed in him.
Right.
And he was good.
And it was a very interesting time because, as I say, it was a very dynamic, it was a very tense deal in the community. There were a lot of people who were very angry. It was the time the Growth Management Act had just been passed, and Chelan County refused to comply with it. And they were being fined by the state government. And Mike Lowry came over and spoke to a forum at the convention center, and there were a lot of very angry people there. They turned off all the lights in the middle of his speech. It was kind of scary, frankly. The militia was there, sitting in the back with their brown uniforms. So it was a time of tension, and the land trust started to really take off at the same time. And I think thanks to Gordon and thanks to other staff, and certainly to Bob Boogert, our current executive director, the land trust has just steadily gained credibility since then. And it's gone from being an organization that was viewed with suspicion by the community leaders to one that has, I think, significant support of the community.
How do you think the land trust has changed? You guys keep talking about how people felt about conservation, or they were, you know, not really excited about conservation in the beginning. How do you think the land trust has changed attitudes in general throughout the area?
Okay, I think I've thought a lot about this, and I think two things have happened. One is, and it's a very important factor, is that the demographics of Wenatchee have changed. There have been a lot of people that have moved in here in the last 10 or 15 years who come from areas that they've seen trashed is too strong a word, but severely impacted by growth and unplanned growth and sprawl and loss of the places that they held dear, whether it was a swimming hole or a place they could play ball or hike or whatever. And I think that has added a perspective to the community that really wasn't there, but certainly not 30 years ago, and probably not even 20 years ago. So that's been a big shift, and I think it's telling that a large number of the membership of the land trust are people who've moved here in the last 10 or 15 years. And I think that's because they've come from other areas, and they realize how precious, how important it is that we preserve what makes this place so special. I think that's one factor. I think the other major factor is that the board of the land trust and the staff, particularly the two executive directors we've had, have been ideal for their position. They both are men with considerable respect in the community. They're both articulate, they're middle of the road, they're moderate, they come across as being very reasonable. And I think the board itself, the members on the board are community leaders in enough different areas of the community that has led credibility to the organization as well. And then at the very basis of it is what I think is so important about the land trust movement, because basically it's an organization of this community. And I get choked up talking about it because I feel so strongly about this. Because it comes from the community. It has inherent credibility in the community, and is now big enough and a broad enough spectrum of the community that has gained credibility through that. There are still people who are opposed to this kind of work, but mostly it's much more of a mainstream organization, as I said a few minutes ago. There are just enough people believe in it, and now it has enough of a track record that the larger community, even though they may not be members or consider themselves conservationists, they can see the benefit that the land trust is giving or is doing to the community. I mean, from the trail system to the river to the preservation of fish stocks to all kinds of reasons. So it's a continuing struggle. I think it always will be a struggle because we'll always deal with this dynamic between development, but I think that between development and conservation, but I think we've gotten the message out that there are places that are appropriate for development, and there are also places that are critical for conservation. And I think that the larger community is accepting that. So those are the factors that I think loom large in why the land trust is, or the difference the land trust has made, or how it's regarded.
Tina, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I would like to say that I think the director and the staff, people that work for the land trust, that are the employees, are just fantastic. I mean, it seems weird to say this right here in front of, but it's just you're the face to the community too, and you're the message to the community. And the board, a lot of people don't know who the board members are, but they do interact with. They do interact with the staff, and the staff, the capacity has grown so much. I mean, you just think about the work of the land trust, how much it's just mushroomed, and somehow you guys all rise up to meet the need that's there, and I think it's going to just continue. I really do. I think it's an organization that's going to continue to grow and play a vital role in our community.
I mean, Tina, you're on the board. Eliot, you're still active in committee. So, I mean, after all this time, so we'll start with Tina. What keeps you engaged, and what keeps you excited enough to do all the work and come to the meetings and all of it? What keeps you so excited about it, the land trust?
Well, the work has been exciting, and it just keeps going on, and it keeps expanding. And the people, the staff, the members of the land trust, the board members are just terrific people. And I guess what keeps me engaged at the board level is the feeling that I have something to contribute. And when I get to the point where I feel like I don't have a lot to contribute, then I think I'll be happy to step back. But it's just wonderful to be a part of such a great organization.
Same question. What keeps you so engaged?
Well, I'm off the board, as you
right.
know, and that's a good thing. You need succession, you need new blood, new ideas, and so on. So I feel strongly that there should be a turnover of board members and presidents and so on. But having said that, I believe, as I just said a minute ago, so strongly in private, non-governmental conservation organizations that I remain very much engaged with the land trust. And I think it's probably the single most effective conservation organization in Chelan and Douglas counties. I mean, there are a lot of other people doing very good work and are very strong partners for us. But I think the fact that it comes from the community, that it sprang out of this community, gives it street cred, if you will, that other organizations, it's harder for them to have that. And I think that this whole tension between development and conservation is going to do nothing but become more important. And for that reason, I just think it's a very important organization, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it, even though I'm much more peripheral than I was. So that's why.
So, Tina, I guess we'll start with you. So what are you most proud of after all this time? What are you most proud of that the Land Trust has done?
Well, there are a lot of things that I'm really so happy to see the Land Trust accomplish. I think that right now, going forward and where we've come so far, I think what we've done with the foothills is just amazing. I mean, I grew to love the foothills when we first got here and we walked them and saw the wildflowers, but they were being, as Eliot said, trashed by motorbikes and off-wheel vehicles, and that's all gone, and it's enjoyed by so many people. People are aware of it, they're learning more about it. I think the trail system is just as good as any I've seen all throughout the West, whether it's Boise or Missoula or wherever it is. I think this is probably the best one I've ever seen.
Is there a particular contribution that you've made or something you've done that you're most proud of, or something that sticks in your mind?
Well, I guess the foothills was sort of my baby from inception, because right from the time I was on the Wenatchee Parks board, and we envisioned that and put it in the plan for the city, and that kept it in that book, and we could bring it out when they, started thinking about it and say, look, it's here in our comp plan, the planning for parks. But what the Land Trust has been able to do in partnering with the state in protecting riparian areas is just so critical. And I'm so proud of the Land Trust for, stepping up to the plate and having the horsepower to do it and do it well and get so much done. And I think it's on a roll, and it's going to continue.
Eliot, I guess same question. What are you most proud of that the Land Trust has done, and then what is your contribution that you're most proud of?
My main contribution has been washing the dishes after the annual dinner, which I'm very good at. I think what I'm most proud of, actually what I'm most proud of was, I think whenever it was, 89 or 91, when we had the Come to Jesus meeting. I think if we hadn't had that meeting, it would have folded. And if we hadn't got some new energetic people on the board, I think it would have folded. And I think I had something to do with that. So I'm proud of that. Not just me, but I mean, there were several of us that just felt so strongly about keeping it going. And that was kind of a critical moment. It almost died then. So I'm very proud of that. I think. What was the rest of your question?
How about something the Land Trust has done that you're most proud of?
That's hard, because I'm proud of a lot of things they've done. I think right now the thing I'm most excited about is Horse Lake Ranch. I think that, in my mind, it's not really done yet, because it's still in flux as to what's going to happen with it. But I think that is going to be an unparalleled community asset if we can keep it in public ownership. And I think it's important that it be kept in public ownership. I think there'll be very few communities in the country of this size that will have basically a wilderness park, if you want to call it that, or that close to town with that kind of an environment and that kind of quality of habitat. I just feel very, very strongly about that, and I think it's the single most important thing that the Land Trust has done. But in terms of there's so much accumulative important things, and I think the White River conservation efforts, the Eliot conservation efforts are going to bear dividends for decades into the future. And I think the trail system, I'm sure that we would not have the foothill trail system if it wasn't for the Land Trust, but I think someday we're going to have the Valley Trail. that Patrick's working on and you
Takes
all are.
time.
And I know damn well that the Valley Trail would never happen if the land trust wasn't here right now. And it's not gonna be easy, but there's no other group that, it's gonna be a difficult, long haul, and really only the land trust has the horsepower to pull that off.
I have another area. I love the fact that the Land Trust has built a conservation community, a conservation consciousness, and a conservation energy in this valley that is there when the issues come up. There's a group of people there that can recognize it, the value of saving this or doing that, and it's going to continue to affect the future of this valley for a very long time.
Yeah, and I'd second that.
Well, a sort of similar question, but since you've been here and you've made this your home and you've seen so many changes, how would you define stewardship? And so, how do you think about stewardship, and how do you think about stewardship of the land in this area for the future? How would you define it, or how do you think about it?
You want to go first?
Well, the Land Trust is a living example of stewardship because we steward our lands, and we're trying to make them better. But I also think that that I think people are becoming more conscious of how important it is. Well, we're in the outreach. I'm on the outreach committee, so we're trying to educate people about noxious weeds, about xeriscaping, about all the things that make this human community interface and fit in with the natural community. I think there's a greater appreciation of the natural areas around us and taking care of them, and just generally in this community, and it'll grow.
I guess I would ask too, how do you see it tying to the economy, or the economic benefit of this area?
Well, there are all sorts. First of all, let me just go back to tag on to what Tina just said. I think that stewardship is really caring for the land with a capital C, and maybe a capital L as well. And I think that a critical part of stewardship that the Land Trust can be effective in is education. I mean, when Susan Ballinger takes all those kids up Saddle Rock, I mean, that is a very hopeful sign for the future. I mean, you have all these fifth graders who learn that all these things don't happen automatically, And so I think if we can educate this next generation in conservation and the importance of conservation, and there are a lot of trite phrases, the interdependent web, I mean, the web of life and stuff, but they're true. I mean, that we depend on these natural systems, and if we can educate the children and get a generation that really grows up with that, that's a very important component of stewardship. Tell me the rest of the question.
Economics?
So senile, economics, yeah. There's no question in my mind that for a community in the West, particularly this part of the West, if it's going to prosper, it has to preserve the land and landscape that it exists in. And there are all sorts of studies that we're all familiar with that have shown this. I mean, the communities that have done well in the West are communities that have established trails and parks and open space and things like a university and an airport and clean industry and so on. But if you dirty your air and screw up your water and have no open space and parks, you're economically toast, because all those attributes will attract people with the skills to provide basically businesses and jobs that are family wage jobs that can support a community. And not just survive, but the community will prosper. And that's been proven over and over again. Some communities prosper too much. I mean, Boise and Bend or Missoula are all struggling with growth because they've been very successful at attracting people who come from the natural environment. So it'll always be a tension between conserving those things that make it so attractive and dealing with the growth that's going to attract. But there's no question in my mind, I mean, Wenatchee is going to has shifted from a resource-based community, which it was when we came. I mean, it was apples and logging and really not much mining, but certainly tree fruit and timber and wheat was what drove this community. And a lot of people say that those still are the things that drive the community. Yes, they are, but less and less and less. And the nature of the global village and world trade and so on is such that to make this community successful in the long run, we've got to preserve these attributes that make people want to live here. They want to come not just for the salaries, but because it's a nice place to live. And it's a nice place to live for the same reason we moved here, you know, and it's just critical that we preserve that.
So what are your hopes for, start with Eliot, what are your hopes for North Central Washington in, let's say, in the next 25 years? What do you hope for it?
I hope that not too many more people will move here. No, I think we can't control that. I think that's going to be a reality because it's not this particular winter, but usually it's wonderful weather and it's a nice place to live, and it's still small. The traffic, even though we think it's bad, is nothing compared to a lot of other areas. So given the reality of growth, I think I think North Central Washington is still at a sort of a tipping point. I mean, I think it's critical that we particularly find some way to preserve some of the tree fruit in the Upper Valley, in the Wenatchee Valley watershed. I think it's an enormous risk of turning into one big suburb. And it may not be possible to do that. We've had a lot of trouble in the land trust trying to preserve orchards or capital-intensive agriculture. But I think we need to work for that, to try and preserve those kind of open spaces. I think North Central Washington is probably, I think its growth is probably going to slow, if you want my sort of predictions based on just reading and no particular expertise. I think I think the big growth areas, at least in this immediate area, are going to be Quincy and Moses Lake, places like that, because the land is cheaper, it has better road access, and given the federal and state budgets, we're not going to be building any more bridges or roads anytime in the near future. So I think the transportation corridor through Wenatchee is going to become more and more difficult, which is going to inhibit some of the economic growth in favor of those communities that have cheaper and more available land. But I think that Wenatchee and Chelan-Douglas, Chelan County in particular, and the west part of Douglas County will remain very attractive places to live, and you'll have people moving in here for the lifestyle, and people telecommuting, people who can work from home, people who it's becoming so much more diverse in terms of all the various small businesses and web-based businesses and all this sort of stuff, and this is a natural for a place like that. For businesses like that.
Tina, what are your hopes for North Central Washington in the future?
Well, most communities, you know, see growth as a positive thing, but I have to admit that this area is geographically limited, especially the Chelan side of it, with the mountains coming down to the river and bridges and the road systems. Yeah, I have to agree with Eliot. I know it'll grow, I just hope it doesn't grow very fast. And I also can see such a difference in this community in awareness of how we're tied to the land and how the quality of the natural lands really affects our way of life. And I think I hope that awareness will continue to grow, and people will come here for the right reasons, or figure it out when they get here or something. But
excuse me, I didn't really answer your question very well. Let me add one more thing. I think my hope would be that we have a world-class trail system from Wenatchee to Leavenworth, around the river, from Wenatchee to Chelan, from Chelan up along the shores of Lake Chelan, things like that. That we continue to have a viable ski area, that we continue to have cleaner air, That we have, that the rivers become cleaner, and that we protect the riverbanks. I mean, these are my hopes that way. And I think from that, we will have a prosperous community with a good economy and good schools and healthy children and all the things that come from that. So, I mean, those would be my hopes.
What are your hopes for the land trust in the next 25, 50, 75, however far in advance you want to go? What are your hopes for the land trust?
I hope it becomes really what it is, but more so. I hope it becomes a major player in both community planning and developing a healthy community in terms of, as Tina just said, our connection to the land, but also a healthy community in terms of our population and the economy and so on. Because the Land Trust ultimately is a community organization dedicated to not only the land, but the people that live here. So, how much bigger it's going to get, I don't know. It'd be wonderful to have 2,000 or 3,000 members, but there's also a point at which it becomes so big that it loses some of frankly, the fun that it is now, where most people know each other and are friends. So too much size is not necessarily a good thing, but I want it to remain an effective community leader in terms of directing those trends.
Want to restate your question?
What do you hope for the land trust in the next 25, 50, 100 years? What do you hope for the land trust in the future?
Well, extrapolating back 25 years, it certainly has increased its effectiveness in this whole area, in a large part of Central Washington. And I would hope and I would think that building on what's already happened, that the Land Trust will continue to be able to reach out to people, to educate people, to pull people into the group, to be there at those critical times when important land needs to be preserved, and more and more people will start looking toward the Land Trust in terms of their what to do with their land. Also, hopefully, as a legacy to this community, they will be giving in their wills to the Land Trust, or they will, give their land or easements on their land. So I hope that it'll just reach out into a broader arena, more into Douglas County. That's a tough one, but out into the upland river corridors, but also into the forest lands. I can see it continuing to do a bigger, better job.
Well, is there anything either of you want to add? Anything you want to say about the land trust in general?
I'm going to add one thing, just to piggyback on that last question. And that is, I think that the Land Trust is going to, I'd like to see us do more with education, because our remarks earlier about developing this generation with a conservation ethic. And I think the Land Trust, along with the schools, can be very effective partners. The other thing I think we're going to have to do, because I've seen it happen in other parts of the state, is we're going to have to get into working forest conservation. I mean, Longview Fiber right now is talking about what are they going to do with their 60,000 acres that they own in Chelan County. And I don't think anybody's talking about making it into a wilderness, but I think we have to try and keep that in working forest. Again, conservation where conservation should go. And a working forest is conservation rather than suburbs. And having the development where the development needs to go, where the infrastructure's there, where we'll unquestionably have higher density. So I'd like to see the Land Trust be a player in that, an effective player, an effective voice. That's all I have to say, except that this has been fun, and you guys are doing great, and I'm glad you're doing this project. And I think it's important for people 25 years from now to sort of have a perspective on what it was like in both 1975 and 2010.
So the Land Trust has already exceeded my expectations. I'm really happy where it has, what it's been able to do and where it's gone in the last 25 years. So the next 25, who knows? On this trajectory.
Oh, well, I would thank
Great
you both, not just for doing it, but because without you guys starting this, I mean, not just I wouldn't have this job, but honestly, that's great. But moving to this area it was a little hard, and it wasn't until I started working at the Land Trust that I really felt like I met people who I could relate to and sort of had a community. So thank you for 25 years ago knowing that.
Us and a lot of other people. But,
Yeah.
but
Thank
you're
you
right.
for joining us.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right, and you're not the only person that said that.
It's nice. Did you either of you want to ask or add anything?
No, I think it was awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I learned
Thank
a
you,
lot.
Kelsey.
Yeah, that was really